Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.
Good morning, Team Krulak community, and on behalf of Marine Corps University, the Marine Corps University Foundation, and the Krulak Center for Innovation and Future Warfare, welcome back to the Broadcast, our series designed to connect the worlds of the warfighter and PME with the best in innovative and creative thought. I'm your host, Major Ian Brown, Operations Officer at the Krulak Center. Before we begin, please remember that all opinions expressed here are those of the individual and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Krulak Center, Marine Corps University, the United States Marine Corps, or any other agency of the U.S. government, or any other entity with which our guests might be affiliated. All right, so for today's episode, we are focusing on the Allied campaign in Burma during World War II, which was one of the most challenging and complex of the conflict, with weather, terrain, and competing strategic objectives among the problems the combined Allied force needed to solve to drive back the occupying forces of Imperial Japan. Our guests on this episode will look at how Allied commanders nevertheless managed to supply, organize, and motivate their composite force to drive the Japanese out in 1945. First, we are pleased to welcome back Broadcast veteran and Team Krulak non-resident fellow, Dr. Rosella Cappella Zielinski. Dr. Zielinski is an associate professor of political science at Boston University and recently served as a visiting fellow at the Clements Center for National Security at the University of Texas at Austin. She specializes in the study of conflict with an emphasis on how states mobilize their resources for war. She is author of How States Pay for Wars. Our second guest is Ryan Grauer, who is an associate professor of international affairs in the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Pittsburgh. He was previously a fellow in the Modern War Institute at the United States Military Academy, West Point, and an academic visitor in Newfield College at the University of Oxford. His research examines the sources and use of military power in the international arena by individuals and collective entities. He is the author of Commanding Military Power. Together, both Rosella and Ryan have published various articles on battlefield coalitions. They have a forthcoming edited volume titled Understanding Battlefield Coalitions, which will be out this fall. And their work today that they'll be discussing is a continuation of their joint work on that very subject. So Rosella and Ryan, thank you very much for joining us today, and I will turn it over to you.
Terrific. Thanks so much, Ian. We appreciate your welcome, your invitation to join you all, and we appreciate everyone in the audience for coming to hear us talk a little bit about what we've been thinking about for quite some time. So what we're going to be talking about today is part of our larger research program into the creation, operation, and achievements of battlefield coalitions. And specifically, we're going to be talking about a slice of a book that we've been working on for far too many years. We're going to get it out soon, entitled Sharing the Foxhole, Why Militaries Fight Together. The book looks at the question of why it is that partners, after having chosen to fight alongside one another in a war, take the next step and put their troops in the same battle space with all of the coordination and cooperation challenges that ensue. Broadly, our answer stipulates that battlefield coalitions form when partners are motivated to do so and when they're able to do so. Motivation, for our purposes, is understood in terms of the stakes of looming combat operations, and ability is understood in terms of logistical capacity to bring the troops, equipment, and supplies necessary to the point of contact and then sustain them over the anticipated length of an operation. So the more we investigate the formation of battlefield coalitions, the more important the logistical component appears to be to us. And so we're going to illustrate that today by talking about the American, British, and Chinese experience in Burma, especially over the 1943-1944 dry season. Over that time period, as we'll talk about, the partners' motivation to fight as part of a battlefield coalition didn't really change, but their logistical capacity did. And we see as that logistical capacity changes, they do form a battlefield coalition and strike against the Japanese. We think there are some really important implications for potential U.S. conflict in the Indo-Pacific today that can be drawn from the North Burma campaign that we're going to be talking about. And we'll return to those at the end of the presentation. And we can certainly talk more about them in the question and answer session if folks are interested.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. All right, so before we dive into logistics, just some quick background on the context of Burma for those who aren't familiar. It's the longest running, continuously contested fight of World War II. And Burma was critical to the Allied war effort, particularly for the Chinese. With essentially a Japanese naval blockade, all supplies reached China by the so-called 2100-mile Burma Road. And for those who are with us and watching, you can look on the map on your left of your screen. The route began down south in Rangoon, River Railroad, again, starting down in Rangoon, going up to Mandalay into the center of the country, and then northeast to Lashio, and then continued via road to Chongqing. The Japanese invasion of Burma began in December 1941. The initial goal was just to recapture the Burmese capital at Rangoon, but it succeeded beyond the attackers' expectations. The Imperial Japanese Army, with support from Thai and local Burmese forces, drove the British, was primarily an Indian fighting force with a small contingent of local Burmese forces, Chinese, and a small group of American volunteer forces from the country. And you can see on the picture on your right, that's American General Stilwell leading the long march out of Burma. And so by the onset of monsoon season in May 1942, British and many Chinese forces had already retreated into India. So the Chinese troops in India were going to be referred to as Stilwell's Lethal Force because the Americans are going to train them for the next couple years. And the remaining Chinese troops, which will be called the Yunnan Force, retreat back into China. And before our period of interest, there are two Allied counterattack attempts during November 42, April 43 dry season. The first is the British attack towards the Arakan Peninsula on the western edge of Burma, which fails due to the British inability at that point to supply its fighting forces within Burma. And the second is British Special Operations long-range penetration assault involving Brigadier Ord's Wingate Chinda's force. They're able to disrupt some Japanese logistics in the rear, but not accomplish anything more than that. So why Burma? Each partner has various stakes. So the Brits, the British, the Americans, and the Chinese all have a different way of thinking about Burma strategically and operationally. For the Brits, despite Burma being their colony and on the doorstep of India, it's really a low priority. They're really forcefully consistent with their quote, Germany first strategy. And even when planning for Burma with the United States at the Casablanca conference in January 1943, they write detailed plans for operation to reopen the Burma Road. It's Operation Anakim, which we'll come to in a minute. During the winter of 43-44 will be made, but it is not possible at this stage to say by when the forces required for this operation could be provided without detracting seriously for the defeat of Germany. So they're forcefully like, no, thank you. For the Chinese, and you can see there's Chiang Kai-shek, Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek there on the left, with General Stilwell and his wife in the middle. Burma's a huge priority. It's really the only way to receive Lend-Lease aid into the country. And Chiang Kai-shek is fighting not just an existential war with the Japanese, they're contending for internal control with Mao and the communists. And I'm happy to talk about it further if anyone's interested. There's also the Hump, which was an air resupply route going from India into China over the Himalayas. But while it is advocated for by various people, it really just doesn't supply enough tonnage for American needs. And Burma is a huge priority for the Americans. And it increases in importance over the period we're interested in. In addition to FDR being deeply committed to Chinese survival, they need the Burma pipeline, which was going to be built to follow along the Burma Road to transfer fuel over to our staging area in China for our B-29 long-range bombers, so we're able to hit targets in Japan. And so we write about this. Anakim is of such importance in respect for its objective, bringing Chinese manpower and geographical position to bear on Japanese forces and positions as to merit the priority which may be indispensable to mount it. So the US, the Chinese, super devoted to reopening up Burma. And if it matters so much to them, why don't they just go at it alone? You know, cut out the UK, get their tacit approval and move forward. And the reality was that due to logistical considerations and supply constraints, no one partner can go at it alone. So China, and here I'm going to refer to the Chinese force in Yunnan, has poorly trained and equipped troops. They have inoperable logistics, and while opening up supplies through Burma is a priority, Chiang Kai-shek is really hoping to free ride on the US and UK. So why not cut out China? Well, if we're going to recapture all of Burma, with an entrenched enemy, which I'll mention in a minute, we need Chinese manpower to cover the eastern flank. The United States is constrained in a different way. So early on in the war, it doesn't have enough trained manpower and having a hard time equipping overseas forces. So at a March Combined Chiefs of Staff meeting, General Marshall says, well, there were 30 divisions that were formed in the past year, quote, the majority of these had only 50% equipment, and that there would be no chance of equipping these 30 divisions fully by March. So they can't do it by themselves either. And the British, while having the colonial manpower, as I mentioned, are not interested. And they just don't have the shipping and lift capacity to take away from Europe to get it into Burma in time. So we've kind of now set up the context. Let's jump into the nasty logistics, which is my favorite part. Burma's a horrible place to fight. So for those who are here, you can see these two maps on your screen really outlining the topography. It has the tallest mountains in the world, the Himalayas to the north, and wide turbulent rivers, which basically cut north to south, that are near impassable, the Salween, the Sitang, and the Irrawaddy. And on top of that, it has some of the worst monsoon seasons in the world. And what happens is that creates dense jungle, washes out infrastructure, and you get a lot of malaria. And this poster on the right basically is Fight the Peril Behind the Lines, is actually a US malaria war poster, but it was truly the Brits who were complaining about malaria throughout and using that as an excuse. And the United States were frustrated with them saying, yeah, you just don't have as good of malaria drugs as we were. Inside Burma, the fun continues. There is no viable airstrip, dirt roads that were often unpassable during monsoon seasons, and bridges are in horrible shape. So everything for any operation had to be brought in and built from scratch, often using local labor. And to make things more fun, getting into Burma was just as hard as being in Burma. Operations from India into Burma were hampered by poor lines of communication, poor river ports that were prone to flooding, single-track rail lines, and narrow dirt roads. And there were also few airfields that could support, via parachuting and supplies, long-range penetration groups. And then to top it all off, you have an entrenched enemy that could overrun Allied forces that are empowered by overland routes through Thailand with continuous lines of communication. So how do these logistical considerations come together to shape Allied operations? And the first one we're going to look at is Operation Anakim, which is an Allied operation that was planned for and abandoned. And the goal here was to recapture all of Burma and reopen the Burma Road. And I just want to stress it was to recapture all of Burma to highlight both the grandiose nature of the campaign and because future operations we're going to talk about get increasingly smaller in scope in terms of the land goals. Anakim was addressed at the combined, that's all right, Brian, keep the slide. The Combined Chiefs of Staff Conference in Casablanca in January 43 and the Trident Conference in May 43. So Anakim itself. The goal was to be a multi-pronged operation with land and air operations to begin at the end of the 1943 monsoon season, from Assam into Burma, via Lido and Imphal, with an advance of Chinese forces from Yunnan. Additional amphibious operations were to take place in the Bay of Bengal against the Burmese coast with the purpose of interrupting Japanese communication between the coast and their northern front, as well as Japanese sea communications into Burma. And again, you can already see the scope of this operation. With the Brits having the manpower, the goal was to be a primarily British offensive with aid from US and Chinese forces. The British would launch basically an amphibious assault in Rangoon and go upwards, starting from the south, go upwards to Mandalay. You would also have Stilwell and the Chinese Lido Force coming in from India going south, meeting up with Mandalay, and the Chinese Yunnan Force coming in from the east, also meeting up with the Allied troops and pushing northwards. And this, again, was an abandoned Allied operation. So how did logistical considerations shape the abandonment of this Allied operation? And what we're going to argue is it actually really gives the Brits cover to double down on their Germany first strategy. So in regards to specific capabilities, the primary constraint was assault shipping and landing craft, specifically getting enough landing craft to Burma from other theaters, mainly Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily, and the Mediterranean. In January 1943, at a combined Chiefs of Staff meeting, Sir Alan Brooke, who's pictured here on your left, the Chief of the Imperial General Staff, reiterated all of these logistical problems and associated limitation, saying it might be difficult, if not impossible, to transfer landing craft from the Mediterranean to the Burma front in time. He says the reconquest of Burma involved large-scale operations followed by extended operations in a very difficult country that must be concluded in a limited period of time, i.e. before the monsoon season begins. Then he goes on to note Japanese reinforcement and states Operation Anakim is thus a very heavy commitment, which we do not feel we can undertake at a time when the war with Germany is approaching its climax and we cannot afford to relax pressure for an instant. I won't read all the quotes, but he goes on to list everything about Burmese topography that I mentioned. But I will note on air superiority, because it's going to come up with Ryan's back half when we get to the Battle of Michina. As for air superiority was essential and what existed was inadequate. Airfields built in Japan entered the war were defensive and located further back than now required. There was only a limited number of forward area, including Assam. And so this allows the Brits to say, what are we doing and why are we doing this at all? Churchill says, let's bypass Burma altogether. Let's focus on air resupply for China and let it go. And he has this quote, which is a little unfriendly. And he says, he could not see how operations in the swamps of Burma would help the Chinese. The United States and the Americans are like, don't listen to the Brits' concerns at all. We are just like, no, we want this operation and we want it this monsoon, like this dry season. Stilwell lays the case saying it's absolutely essential to open land communications with China. It's going to have a great effect on their morale. Munitions transported will be used to build up a second group of 30 divisions, which had been promised to a generalissimo. And so if we don't do this, the entire Chinese army and forces in Yunnan are going to disappear and China is going to fall. And then we're going to have to fight our way up through the islands to defeat Japan. General Marshall, for his part, goes so far as to threaten to withdraw American commitments to the European theater. And I read like 1,000 pages of transcripts, and I know this is going to come off a little benign sounding when I quote it, but I promise you it blew my mind. He's like, unless Operation Anakim could be undertaken, he felt that the situation might arise in the Pacific at any time that would necessitate the United States regretfully withdrawing from the commitments in the European theater. I just want to say that's a really big threat. It becomes a hollow threat, but it was very grandiose for him to say. And despite American push for the operation, it's abandoned and the British are able to continue to exercise their Germany first strategy. And with that, I turn it over to Ryan.
So as Rosella mentioned, Operation Anakim was ultimately abandoned around May 1943 at the start of the 1943 monsoon season. And as the rains fell in Burma and elsewhere in the theater, the British, Americans, and Chinese continued to try to envision some sort of combined operation to strike at the Japanese in the country. They imagined whittled down versions of Anakim, including Operations Triumphant, Tarzan, Buccaneer, and Pigstick. But the problem with all of these was they all required an amphibious assault, and the British weren't going to move the landing craft from Europe to Burma to sustain that kind of operation. And so you have this sort of stalemate in terms of motivation. The British continue to want to kind of bypass Burma, consider perhaps going down through Sumatra and Malaya and strike at a Chinese port to supply the Chinese that way. The Americans, as advocated by Joseph Stilwell with his Lido force, want to push south from Lido at the northern tip of Burma, drive south to create space, to create overland communications between India and China. And Chiang Kai-shek is really suspicious of any sort of combined operation in Burma at all. And he's pleading with the British and the Americans to just forget a land assault during this coming dry season and focus on stepping up efforts to provide air supply, equipment, rations, etc. over the hump. Ultimately, the Allies get on the same page in terms of the possibility of fighting together, not because of anything that they decide, but because of what the Japanese do. This dithering among the Allies continues, and they're ultimately pushed in the direction of forming a battlefield coalition. In February 1943, the Japanese strike first at the southernmost portion of the British part of the line. The Japanese initiate and ultimately lose what's come to be known as the Battle of Admin Box on the Arakan Peninsula. And then in March 1944, the Japanese launch Operation Yugo, which was their major strike into India, their push towards Imphal and Kohima. So the mass of the Japanese army in Burma pushes to the west. And what that does is it creates space down through the center of the country where Stilwell's Lido Force, which had started advancing into the country in December 1943, suddenly had more open space, and they were making more progress than what they had anticipated. And so the Allies were in this place where the Japanese were going on the offensive, and they really only had one opportunity to strike back in an offensive way, and that was to reinforce Stilwell's Lido attack or not, and wait for the next dry season. And this was actually a choice for them in a way that Anakim and previous efforts weren't, because they now had the capacity to bring together their various troops, equipment, and supplies at the point of contact and sustain them for a push through northern Burma. And to highlight this, I want to talk for a little bit about some of the logistical improvements that the Allies made around this same time. So there were two big problems that the Allies had to overcome to be able to launch a combined operation into Burma. The first was getting troops, equipment, and supplies from the port of Calcutta in India, where all of those resources entered the theater, to Lido, at the border of India and Burma. And then getting all of those troops, equipment, and supplies from the border to the troops that invaded the country. So if we think first about that first step, the transit from Calcutta to Lido, the challenge here was the Assam line of communication. And this was a network of railways that was really not very good. Infrastructurally, it was poorly designed and poorly structured. The railway lines were built on multiple gauges, so trains couldn't travel in a continuous line from Calcutta to Lido. The mechanisms for transferring loads from trains running on one gauge to another were very slow and inefficient, and any sort of efforts to standardize gauge lines were moving along very slowly. The second problem with the Assam line of communications is that both the port of Calcutta and the railways connecting Calcutta and Lido were under the control of the civilian government of India. And so that meant that the civilian government was in charge of making improvements, but also deciding which trains ran when. And so the military units weren't getting the priority that they needed on those train lines to get their supplies to launch a combined offensive. So this problem starts to get resolved when on the 6th of November 1943, there's an agreement struck between the military component in theater and the government of India that allows for increasing military control over both the port of Calcutta and the Assam line of communication. And progressively, you get more and more military control over both of these entities until on the 1st of March, 1944, you have American railway troops in complete control over the Assam line of communication. And those American railway troops were headed up by an Army colonel by the name of J.A. Appleton. And Appleton, in his civilian life, was the general manager of the New York zone of the Pennsylvania Railroad. So he had railroad expertise and was able to use that to try to start to rationalize the Assam lines of communication. He was able to double the length of the trains that were run along the lines of communication. He was also able to bring in American locomotive engineers to guide the trains through trickier and poorly built stretches of track. And he was able to order those American railway troops to step up the effort to standardize the gauge lines. And Appleton's effect was really quick. Very soon, even before the railway lines were standardized in terms of their gauges, you had a 50% increase in the amount of military traffic going over the Assam line of communication. And in fact, the train transit goals set for October 1944 were met by the end of April. 1944. Appleton did such a good job that at the end of April 1944, he was removed from the China, Burma, India theater and sent to the Middle East to try to sort out some of the railway issues the Allies were having there. So that really helped resolve the issue of getting supplies from the port of Calcutta to the border with Burma. Getting those supplies to the troops fighting in Burma really required improvements on the air supply side. Remember, as Rosella talked about, Burma is a really terrible place to fight. The mountains, the rivers, the forests, the monsoon make conventional logistical supply efforts really infeasible. And so the Allies understood that they would have to rely much more heavily on airdrops of supplies. And Admiral Louis Mountbatten, who was the newly installed commander-in-chief of the Southeast Asia Command, or SEAC, recognized this, and he went to Brigadier Ord Wingate, the commander of the Chindits, even before he formally assumed the position of commander-in-chief of SEAC, to talk about the possibility of scaling up some of the air supply efforts that the Chindits used in the previous dry season, ways that they might try to make it more feasible to conduct not only more long-range penetration assaults, but even supply regular forces moving into Burma. In addition, Mountbatten requested and received literally tons of parachute silk from the government of India, and had 400 power sewing machines sent from England to India to facilitate the creation of all of the parachutes that he anticipated needing to provide all of these air supplies. So preliminary experiments and trials in scaling up the Chindits air supply efforts went really well. And in February 1944, SEAC creates combat cargo groups that are specifically targeted with provisioning through air all of the forces that would be striking into India. And the combat cargo groups rely on American industrial techniques to make their provision capabilities stronger. This includes things like standardizing the loads put on planes, designing plants where all of these resources are held so that it's very quick to move material from the warehouses to the planes, using production line techniques in packaging. All of these steps taken really accelerated the capacity of the Allies to provide more and more tonnage through air supply. And you can see in the chart on your left that these efforts really had a quick impact. In all of 1943, there was slightly less than 5,000 tons of equipment and supplies dropped into Burma by the Allies. That was a total that was exceeded in the first 2 months of 1944. And then in March 1944, after the combat cargo groups are stood up, you have almost as much tonnage dropped in a single month that you did in all of 1943. And so this acceleration of the provision of supplies through the air continues, and it's really needed because the troops fighting in Burma, they needed basically everything delivered to them through the air. Oil and gasoline were dropped in 55-gallon drums that were protected by rice husks. Rations, both for humans and animals, were sent in 35-pound burlap sacks. The animal forage was particularly important given the challenges of moving through Burma. Each of the divisions that I'll be talking about in a little bit had about 1,000 ponies, mules, and horses attached to them to help with the transport of goods. And almost all of the forage needed for those animals had to be provided by air supply. The Chinese units that Stilwell commanded received live poultry and pigs to celebrate really effective combat actions or to mark feast days. You can see in the picture on the bottom right, eggs were packaged and dropped through air supply. And then you have all of the conventional military supplies that you would need, ammunition, radios, radio parts, high explosives, carts, things like that, that are delivered. So at the time that the Allies are facing down the Japanese attack and thinking about whether or not to reinforce this preliminary effort made by Stilwell's Lido Force, they now have this ability to supply troops going deeper into Burma that they just didn't have before. And so they make the choice to double down on what Stilwell's doing. The Lido Force is rechristened the Northern Combat Area Command, and Stilwell is put in charge not just of 3 Chinese divisions, the 22nd, the 38th, and the 30th, but increasingly other combined forces. So on the 1st of February 1944, the Fort Hers Detachment was assigned to NCAC. The Fort Hers Detachment was comprised of what were referred to as the Kachin Levies, or native Burmese fighters under the command of British officers. Shortly thereafter, Mountbatten, the commander of SEAC, moved Wingate's Chindit force to NCAC. And then you had the attachment of the 5307th Provisional Infantry Regiment, better known to us as Merrill's Marauders, the American version of Ord Wingate's Chindits. And so you really do have this combined force striking south from the northern tip of Burma. And the details of the fighting on the progression south are really interesting, but they're sort of beside the point. If you look at the maps, you can see the designation of the different kinds of actors that were involved. The solid orange lines represent the movements of the Chinese divisions. The solid green lines represent the movements of Merrill's Marauders. The black lines represent the movements of the Fort Hers Detachment. And then on the map on the right, you see orange outlined arrows. Those represent the movements of the Chindit force. And the movements of Merrill's Marauders, the Chindits, and the Fort Hers Detachment are really crucial here. They're striking towards Myitkyina, which is an important goal for the Allies at this point, because Myitkyina is located in a really decisive area. First, it's far enough into Burma that the capture of Myitkyina would almost certainly require the destruction of the 18th Japanese division that was protecting it, fully 1/5 of the Japanese forces in Burma. Second, Myitkyina was far enough south that capture of the airfield and improvement of the infrastructure there would allow the Allies to fly south of the Himalayas rather than over them, so avoid going over the hump, and you could have more fuel-efficient flights and send more supplies per plane that's sent to China. And Myitkyina sat at a regional crossroads. It had road and rail connections to the rest of Burma, and more importantly to China. So it would be possible to build a landline of communications from India through Myitkyina to China. And so if you look at the movements of Merrill's Marauders, the Fort Hers Detachment, and the Chindits, you see that they're really crucial to this strike on Myitkyina. Those units were all supplied exclusively by air. The Chinese divisions also received a significant amount of their supplies by air, but they also benefited from the creation of roads and complex lines of communication that followed them south. But those lines of communication were supplied by all of those, all of that bolstered capacity, stretching along the Assam line of communication from the port of Calcutta to Lido. So by the time Myitkyina's airfield falls on the 17th of May, 1944, you have this combined operation carried out, but really only sustained by those logistical improvements that the Allies had made to that point in time. And so we could talk much more about this, and we're going to write a whole book about it. But for our purposes today, we're going to stop here and highlight what we think are some of the important lessons that could be taken away from the North Burma campaign. And the first point that we want to note is that the North Burma campaign really seems to be a crucial episode for contemporary planners to think about for a few reasons. First, it involved multiple partners, some of whom were native to the region in which combat was taking place, and some were external. Second, the Allies had some familiarity with each other, but they didn't have anything like the institutionalized relationships that NATO has fostered for the US and its potential partners in Europe over the past several decades. Third, the Allies were fighting a powerful, entrenched adversary that not only felt it had the right to control the territory that it occupied, but recognized the strategic necessity of keeping its enemies from retaking that territory. Fourth, the combat was waged in a really difficult, unforgiving environment. And then finally, logistics were contested. Japanese submarines disrupted delivery of supplies to the port of Calcutta, and at least for the first portion of the North Burma campaign, Japanese airstrikes were made against Allied airfield, rail, and engineering assets. And so in short, this North Burma campaign possesses many of the features that would make a future operation in the Indo-Pacific incredibly difficult. And so with that in mind, what are some of the what are a few of the more important of the many lessons that we could take away? There are three that we want to highlight here. The first point that we would want to note is that logistics, perhaps even more so than competing visions about how to carry out operations against an adversary, are really likely to serve as a constraining factor on the creation and operation of battlefield coalitions. If you can't bring everyone's troops, equipment, and supplies together and sustain them, those operations just aren't going to be carried out. Second, while the U.S. has increased the number and complexity of its operational exercises with partners in the Indo-Pacific, and we're looking at ways to link in potential partners with American command and control systems, it's also really important to think about logistical interoperability. Each of the potential partners of a battlefield coalition in the Indo-Pacific are going to have their own supply services. And those services need to be able to speak to and work with one another, if only to ensure that the equipment and supplies that are needed at various points on the battlefield are able to be moved there when they're needed. And then finally, a point that's likely to spark a little bit of mirth among this audience is that the U.S. in particular needs to approach combined operations with a greater tolerance for improvisation and flexibility. So summarizing the North Burma campaign, the U.S. Army's official historians noted, quote, "Normally, planning precedes logistical preparation and logistical preparation fighting. One of the noteworthy aspects of the North Burma campaign of 1943-1944 is that logistical preparations, the planning, and the fighting proceeded simultaneously. Troops moved forward before commanders agreed on their plans, and the logistical preparations were months in being completed." The flexibility that the US, the British, and the Chinese exhibited in North Burma allowed them not only to create a battlefield coalition, but allowed them to use that battlefield coalition in ways that they could respond to the emergent challenges posed by the Japanese, seize unexpected opportunities, and ultimately succeed in driving the Japanese out of North Burma and setting the stage for ultimately retaking the entirety of the country during the next dry season. So with that, we're going to stop and welcome any questions that you all have. Thank you very much for listening to what we've been thinking and talking about.
All right, great. Thank you to Ryan and Rosella very much for that overview. And something that's sort of become a mantra in the Marine Corps in recent years, especially looking at the Indo-Pacific region, is logistics is the pacing challenge. And I think this case study really kind of drives that home. So to the audience, if you have any questions, just go ahead and throw them in the chat. I've already got a couple here that I'll get to. Before I do that, I just had a couple things I wanted to throw out there to get your view on. First off is I guess myself and any Marine who's should have done the reading on the reading list has come across like General William Slim's Defeat into Victory, looking at the British perspective of this campaign, and I've read it. It's been a little while, but I read it. But what you brought out here is I don't think I ever really appreciated just how much aerial delivery of supplies of all types was such a vital part of this. So I guess one, was there any equivalent aerial lift operation to this in any other theater of the war? And then second with that, was there, I imagine there were some second order logistical requirements to establish air superiority to let those deliveries go through, because you're not just going to send those cargo planes alone and unafraid. So I imagine in the background there would have been a whole other layer of, fighter escorts, strikes against Japanese airfields and things like that to make sure that almost complete reliance on aviation delivery could continue. So can you go into that a little bit more detail if you can?
Yeah, I can say a few words about that. So you're absolutely right, taking the last point first about the need for establishing air superiority. And that was one of the key focal points for the Allies during the preceding dry season. By about sort of March, April 1944, the Allies had established air superiority over the northern half of Burma. So they were able to they were able to provide these air supplies. But the ongoing focus on achieving at least sort of control over key air routes was an ongoing issue from the very beginning because of the air supply routes the air supply sent over the hump from India to China. Because those flight paths, as one of the maps that Rosella had very early in the presentation, went over North Burma. So even after the Allies were driven out of North Burma, or out of Burma totally, by early 1942, there was concerted effort to maintain the ability to fly over those bits of territories. And so building on those sorts of efforts, they were able to push out the zone over which transport planes could safely fly. With respect to your first question, I'm not an expert on air supply elsewhere in other theaters during World War II, but my understanding from reading about the setting up of this system in Burma was that it was really due to the distinct problems of trying to fight in Burma that really weren't present in almost any other theater. Rosella, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, just to add briefly, so full disclosure, we've been in the mostly high level documents. We have a bunch of archival stuff pulled from local commanders. We haven't been able to sift through them, but I never really saw a reference to other aerial lift operations elsewhere in the war, like a lessons learned, we can do that here. So it's really like just isolated to the unique nature of Burma. And as for the hump, and I know Albert here mentioned this in the chat, they were really concerned about Japanese interdiction. And they were actually quite surprised that the Japanese weren't attacking a lot of flights in the hump. They were like, why are they not doing it? We're going to roll with that, but we're not pleased with it. So we had a lot of already, as Ryan mentioned, associated air superiority conversations that have been ongoing.
Great, thank you both. And to kind of to jump off of that a little bit more, another thing I'd noted to bring up to you was the question of Japanese interference, because you had the aviation supply lines that were potentially, one, vulnerable, but two, also like fairly predictable. Like if you're a Japanese aviation planner, you kind of know where they're going to go, right? And the same thing I would imagine for the naval supply lines going into Calcutta. There's only one good port where that can handle that cargo and then transport it effectively. The aviation piece, they were surprised there wasn't any interdiction, but why were the Japanese not able to more successfully interdict this? I realized that both sides were probably at the very end of their various abilities to project power, but Burma's a lot closer to Japan than Calcutta is to the United States, right, or the United Kingdom. So why was Japan not able to effectively get after those predictable and vulnerable lines of communication?
So Ryan may have a more robust answer, but from everything that I've seen so far, it's exactly what you suggested. The Japanese were being stretched thin. So they weren't putting as much in, not that they were not defending Burma, but they were stretched in, and that was to a surprise of the Allies. They were like, why is this not happening in other areas? But Ryan, do you have a more robust answer than that?
Yeah, I think it really has to do with the fact that Japan is fighting a massive war across a huge theater. And the period that we're talking about with the buildup of the port of Calcutta and the Assam line of communication, this is happening in late 1943, 1944. So we're well past the Battle of Midway. Japan is reeling from the advance of American forces in the Pacific and MacArthur up from the south. And Burma is on the far western edge of their focus. And so I think I've not looked into Japanese constraints. My guess is that they simply didn't have the resources and were hedging by focusing on operations closer to the home islands. And it's notable, I've always been a little bit surprised that Japan only had 5 divisions in Burma. Burma's a big country with really rough terrain. And 5 divisions struck me as not. If I had my druthers, I would want more than 5 divisions. And I think it was mostly just the Japanese were running out of resources to put into this theater.
All right, great. Thank you both very much. Okay, I'm going to start going to some of the questions in the chat here. And first one, I'm going to kind of combine a couple of questions from our audience members looking at the issue of the railway control um, between the civil and military authority. And one audience member notes that it sort of has echoes of back in World War I, French control of railways behind the Western Front. And so can you go into a little bit more detail on, given the importance of that rail hub, like to basically like keep the Japanese from invading India, why did it take so long to move from Indian governmental authority to military authority, to prevent that from happening, essentially by moving those supplies quickly?
Yeah, so I can talk a little bit about that. Part of the story is an issue that we didn't have time to really get into. I mentioned briefly that the Allies stood up Southeast Asia Command in November 1943. This wasn't the first time that they tried a combined command. They attempted ABDA Command very early in the war, but that fell apart due to sort of fights over who had control of what. But for an extended period of time, you had the Americans, the Chinese, and the British all waging sort of parallel fights in the Burma theater. And it wasn't really until you get the concerted effort taken at, is it Trident in May, Rosella?
Yeah, I can't remember, but I think
Trident
so.
Conference in May to create this combined command where the military is suddenly speaking with one voice and speaking against a well-established institutionalized entity like the government of India. They needed that capacity, and ultimately some thumbs on the scale from London saying, all right, we actually need to bend to military needs here. And so part of the story is that you had multiple military voices calling for different things. Part of it's what Rosella talked about. The British, even though Burma was right on the doorstep of India, was seen as not nearly as important as the war in Europe. And so there was less focus in London on what was happening there. And so I think it was a little bit of organizational incapacity on the military side, plus inattention at the political level, until it became clear that something had to be done. And I think that would be the root of the delay.
All right, great. Thank you. Okay, next question, and this kind of jumps into your final point there on those lessons learned about the need for improvisation in how you approach this kind of logistical, both the logistics and the coalition warfare aspect. And you mentioned some of those, some of the aerial delivery methods of innovation, like wrapping some of the cargo, in rice shoots or leaves to sort of cushion the blow. I'm also sort of curious how the chickens and pigs thought about being parachuted down to be eaten later, but probably not a line of question we need to follow too closely. But outside of obviously the innovations for the to keep the aerial delivery of supplies going of all kinds, were there any other innovations in terms of either on the aviation side you didn't cover, or on how they solve the problem of ground delivery of logistics across those lines? Whether it's the different rail gauges or how you sort of at the end point, how you drive those supplies forward, the last little while towards the front lines.
Yeah, so one of the things that struck me, if we go back, if you look at the photo in the lower right, at the foot of the soldier packing the eggs, you see a basket. That's referred to as a country basket. It was something that Indian peasants created to carry their goods. And through trial and error, the Allies figured out that those baskets were actually really, they were able to suspend and protect a lot of the goods that they were sending down. And so those baskets would be part of the free drop issue. So if you look at the table, I've parsed out the delivery of tonnage from stuff that's landed, so planes that land on constructed airstrips, stuff that's parachuted in, has the parachutes and free dropped. That's stuff that's just thrown out the back of a plane, like you see in the photo in the upper right. And so figuring out how to do each of those, it really was sort of trial and error, and being willing to accept suggestions from everyone. So one of the things that the Allies enjoyed in particular was that a lot of the conscripted American troops came from, industrial backgrounds, or came from farms, and they had ideas about how they would do things back in their civilian life that they could apply to the military problems. And they developed a culture as they were sort of scaling up the air supply problem, of accepting suggestions from the very bottom. Anyone who had a good idea about how to make this happen faster, more efficiently, great, let's hear it. And hopefully it'll work out. And if it doesn't, we'll discard it and move along to the next idea. So it really was sort of a cultural willingness to accept ideas from all comers.
Thanks, Rosella. Anything to add to that?
No, but this, we've read a lot of logistical, case studies, and it reminds me of something General Pagonis in the Gulf War fostered, was really hearing bottom up ideas when we were, when the United States was in Iraq, and how to work with our allies and partners and those who are most familiar with the issue at hand. And so I think that was really just, this listening to Ryan, give his answer reminded me of how important this is in the moment, in theater.
All right, thank you. Yeah, and Ryan, as you described it, it sort of echoed in my brain a topic of discussion we had on a broadcast, I don't know, a month or so ago. But we talked about, I was talking about the relief of the foreign legations in Beijing during the Boxer Rebellion, and one of the big things they had to do is they had this tiny little force of, it was Coalition Force One, but also they had to basically rebuild the railway under fire to drive some of the supplies up there. I was like, how did they do that? Right. And, and it was the same thing. They had people who'd worked on railways who were able to reconstruct those lines. And it was leveraging that bottom up talent management. And I can certainly imagine in a future conflict in the Indo-Pacific region, you're going to have to use everybody's ideas, because you may be sort of alone and unafraid out there, and you've just got the ideas from the people you have. So.
And I just wanted on an extra smile that when you mentioned that a Brutecast, which we listened to, this book will also have a chapter on the Boxer Rebellion, and we're intrigued by it because we're bringing in everything for Burma, but 1901 Boxer Rebellion, you're going to be fighting with what you have in theater, so it's going to be a very different logistical constraints. And we want to explore that then affects how, this 8-nation partner alliance works together. So more from us on that.
Yeah, I look forward to it. And maybe you'll cover one of my favorite examples of that coalition innovation from the Boxer Rebellion broadcast was, I think it was called the International Cannon, where it was a piece of Chinese, in our Chinese artillery tube on an Italian gun carriage, firing Russian ammunition or something like that. Just making it work with what they had. Okay, I'll go through a couple more questions here, and then we'll wrap it up here at the top of the hour. So next question goes into the question of sort of the motivation, or the morale and the driving forces of the troops. So there were obviously different levels of sort of political will in terms of how important everybody thought this particular area was. What if any impact did that have on the troops actually carrying out those operations, or conversely, was there an effective cohesion between the militaries that maybe drove kind of, again, from the bottom up, better sort of political unity in terms of pursuing that campaign? If that question makes sense.
Yes, I think part of it, by the time we get to Michina, and Ryan can speak to this more, we've had multiple years where we have the Americans in China working to develop the strength and capacity of the Chinese forces in preparing for this, as well as Stilwell's lethal force in China. And so I think there was, so let me go back for a second. The Chinese are just in such horrible shape in Yunnan. They have no heavy artillery. They're fighting on a patchwork equipment that is just coming in from everywhere. When you said, this cannon, which is Chinese artillery on a German something, and I can't remember your words now, apologies, but that's essentially what the Chinese have. And they're, deserting left and right and morale. So we've had multiple years by this point of preparing to work with each other. And that is because of the heavy US influence. And we are equipping over these couple years before Michina, the Chinese with everything. And that allows for them to better work together by default. Because there's many moments where they're like, oh, is the Chinese ready? In the East, the Yunnan Force, yes, no. And that is one of the conversations. But it never bubbles up to be the driving force because these larger structural logistical considerations outpace that in that conversation. Ryan, do you want to add?
Well, just on the point of morale generally, here's another instance where the creation of a combined command structure really helps. And putting Mountbatten in charge was a good choice, because Mountbatten recognized that the troops that had been fighting in the India, Burma, China theater had been sort of given the short shrift in terms of not only supplies but also sort of prestige. In the way that the war was talked about, and so one of the first tasks that he took upon himself after standing in as commander-in-chief of SEAC was to go around to lots of units, very small units, and give really sort of inspiring speeches to try to boost morale. And so you have a commander at the top who recognizes the need to boost morale. But then also you have the creation of distinct units, like Merrill's Marauders, who were all volunteers, who were told that they were being brought together for this special mission that was going to be crucial to the U.S. effort in the Burma theater. The Marauders suffered an incredible casualty rate. I think the end casualty rate was something like 95%. But the fact that they were all volunteers going through this really intense experience that they were told was really important together, the forge of war really fashioned over time units with high levels of morale until they literally could not continue to fight.
Great, thank you. And your point again on the combined command structure, it echoed again that discussion we had about the Boxer Rebellion, where you've got all these different nations together who's in charge, and who makes the plan, and that can be it's a very important and can be a very difficult question, especially if you don't have any previously established structure to do that. Like there was no NATO for the Chinese, Brits, and the Americans to figure that out. So again, another good example of being flexible and able to improvise in terms of those very necessary structures. Okay, we're about right an hour here, so audience, I'm going to have to drop off the questions here. But to Rosella and Ryan, thank you very much for your time today. Any final thoughts or comments you'd like to make before we wrap up?
No, thank you for having us. And you really tapped into one of our interest here is for the lessons for the Indo-Pacific. What do you do when there's no NATO? And that's something, a lot of folks who study battlefield coalitions just think NATO oriented. And so that's one of our big missions of what do you do in that moment, especially in a contested logistical space. So thank you for mentioning that. And, thank you again for everyone for being here today.
I would just echo Rosella's thanks. We appreciate you taking the time to listen to what we've been working on and what we've been thinking about. And hopefully we can contribute to the conversation of how to actually make combined operations work more effectively. And as Rosella noted, in an area of the world where there's not a decades-long institutionalized cooperative effort.
Great, thank you. And I think that's a great point to emphasize and wrap up on here. All right, so to our guests, to Dr. Zielinski and to Ryan Grauer, thank you very much for your time today. To our audience, thank you as always for joining us. I'll note that we, Brewcast, we've got a couple more coming up here that I can talk about starting tomorrow, where we're fortunate to have a panel discussion featuring Ambassador Philip Kosnet, who is the editor of a edited volume released by Marine Corps University Press called Boots and Suits, Historical Cases and Contemporary Lessons in Military Diplomacy. So we're going to have him and a panel of contributors to talk about their work on the book and their various experiences and in that sort of coordination between the diplomatic and military arms. And then next week, still working on the exact time, but we are trying to reschedule that Talent Management 2030 update session with the Talent Management Strategy Group. So pretty close to doing that. And when that exact date and time comes out, I'll be sure to post that on our email distribution list and our social media channels. But beyond that, thank you again for your time today. Thank you for joining us, and we will see you on the next episode.
Thanks, Ian. You're amazing as always.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. As always, we depend on support and feedback from the Team Krulak community to constantly improve our offerings and reach a wider audience. So if you have feedback on this episode, please take a moment to fill out the survey linked in the show notes to help us do better. Also, if you enjoyed this episode, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel on YouTube, or leave us a review on the podcast app of your choice. It truly does help us reach a wider audience. Thank you as always for your support, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.